Welcome back to Sunday Morning Cafe, our ongoing conversation about building and maintaining resilience through difficult times. Today, we will look at what many think is the very foundation of resilience. You know how in real estate they say there's three rules? There's location, location, location. Well, in resilience studies, many think there's also three rules. But those three rules are relationship, relationship, relationship. In fact, arguably the longest standing resilience study that's ever been undertaken took place over the course of 80 years, and it's still going on. The Harvard study started off with like 370 subjects, and then they added 400 some more. Rigorous study. George Valent was the primary investigator in that study. He said if you want to know what makes people resilient, if you want to know what the key finding from that study was, if you want to know what makes people happy, if you want to know what makes people age well, it comes down to one word, he said. And that word is love. Full stop. Comes down to love. You never hear social scientists speak that way, but that's exactly what he said. He said before our study, you didn't hear a lot in experimental psychology about empathy and warmth, but now you do. In the physical sciences, Carlo Rovelli said, if you want to know the key to the success of the human species evolutionarily, it comes down to one word. Guess what that word is? Love. That's a physical scientist. Again, the key to resilience, relationships, relationships, relationships. So today, what we'd like to focus on together in our conversation is looking at what are those key ingredients that make our relationships have a quality to it that give us resilience and that make for resilient relationships themselves. To do that, I'd like you in your mind's eye to kind of just be exploring your own relationships. And before it's all said and done, I'm going to invite you to plot your relationships on a grid. And let me tell you what that grid's going to look like. A dartboard. So you start off with the bullseye in the center, which I'm going to end up calling your circle of resilience. Out from there's a concentric circle and a concentric circle and a concentric circle. Out in the periphery, about where Pluto would rotate around the sun, that's where you'll have those relationships that are just the friendly people you bump into in the grocery store. They recognize you, you recognize them, you don't know their names necessarily. The people walking by with their dogs. Come to find out that's part of resilience too, those kinds of relationships. In from there, we're likely to have those folks that you bump into at church or temple or synagogue or some other organization that you belong to. You don't really hang out with them, but they're those friendly acquaintances that you like. Bring it in a little further, and now what are we talking about? Those folks that we get to maybe semi-annually, quarterly. Bring it in a little more, those folks we watch games with and get together with. But right there in that inner circle, the circle of resilience, I want to say those people are they're like those crucibles that are used in steel mills. You know, those containers that are strong enough that they can handle metallurgic reactions. You can melt down a couple different kinds of metals and make a new metal. They are those safe containers in our life. And so I want to just look at for a moment, what are the characteristics of a good safe container? How do you know when you've found one? Well, one thing's for sure. They can practice a thing that I mentioned earlier. They can practice empathy. They can put themselves in your shoes and feel alongside you. And they allow you to step into their shoes to know what's going on with them. Which brings up another point that the social scientist Brené Brown has written an awful lot about. The very warp and woof of close relationships, relationships that lend themselves to resilience, vulnerability. A person's ability to make it so that I don't have to wear a mask with you. Don't get me wrong, I know. To keep each other safe, we got to wear a mask out there. But what I'm talking about is in these relationships, I don't have to monitor my brand with you. I don't have to be a false self. I don't have to curate myself to make myself look better. What you see is what you get in those relationships. In these crucibles, I mentioned that they melt down different metals. Well, in these relationships with vulnerability, it's okay if you melt a little bit or they melt a little bit. You know there'll be mutual support. Now, what do you not want to find in one of these relationships that is in your circle of resilience. Well, here's one thing you don't want to find there. You don't want to find the practice of serial confidentiality. You know what I mean by that? Tom Wagner told me this, and he told me not to tell anybody, so you can't tell anybody, okay? Somebody who's a safe container for you in your inner circle, that needs to be a person who, when you tell them, it stays put. It stays put. You can count on that. And you remember that that human tendency that I want to talk about, you know, where a couple of us get together and we exist on this higher plane of existence, and now we're discussing some poor unfortunate soul that exists on this lower plane of existence. The tendency to do this is about as old as original sin, I think. You know how it is that sometimes we want to bask in the glow of a shared hatred, and it almost feels like we love each other when we're doing that because it feels so good to be at this higher plane of existence. It's not love, and it's really not real warmth. It's a pseudo-intimacy, and it erodes our resilience like sugar erodes tooth enamel over time. Don't get me wrong, there is a place for venting. You know, when you get together with somebody and you hear yourself saying, I thought I was the only one that felt that way. There's a place for that, but you get what I mean when you get over that threshold of healthy venting, you go to that next place. What resilient people know how to do is to keep those conversations at a bare minimum, if at all. Another characteristic of a resilient relationship in this inner core that I'll call the circle of resilience, you'll know that you have picked a bad person to be in that inner circle with you when they're always in agreement with you. When you're describing the latest injustice done to you by a child or your partner, and they're always agreeing with you, you'll know you found someone that belongs in your inner circle when once in a while they ask you, well, what were you doing just before she did what she did? A good inner circle person is not afraid to kick your butt once in a while and will allow you to kick their butt once in a while so that we can grow. Another important topic to bring up before we conclude our conversation would be this. I want you to imagine that you and I are in this old-time Western town that has exactly 2 wells in the center of town. And every day you sit in your, I guess it'd be a log cabin or something like that, and you're looking out the window and you're seeing this woman come to the well every day at about the same time. She puts her bucket down into that well, she pulls it back up again, you see her lift it to her lips and she pours the contents in, and the next thing you see is spitting dust out of her mouth. After a while, you'd want to point out to her that that other well on the left over there, I keep seeing people go there, dropping their buckets down and bringing up refreshing water. Why don't you just go to that well? This is kind of an important topic. Not just who gets to be in our inner circle, but who doesn't belong in that inner circle. For some of us, there are people that we've allowed into our inner circle where every time we try to find something refreshing there, what we get is just dryness instead. And you might be thinking, yeah, but Tom, the person that you're describing is a relative of mine. It's somebody that I have an ethical responsibility to be in connection with. To which I'd say, well then, maybe you need to call that for what it is. That's volunteer work. You don't come to that relationship to get fulfilled, you go to that relationship to discharge a duty. And once you can name it the correct way, why, then you don't spend maximal time with that person, you spend a minimum amount of time with that person. You go into it calling it for what it is, volunteer work, not one of my inner circle people, because what that does for you is you're no longer expecting to get something from that relationship. In fact, when you know you have to be with that person, instead of 4 hours, maybe you'll go 1 hour, and maybe you'll see someone that you call your intentional family member, your family member of choice, where you do get filled up when that other person sucked you dry just a little bit. Relationship, relationship, relationship. In that inner circle, you want to have 2, maybe 3, 4. I've heard some say you can have 5. I'm not sure about that. But 2, 3, 4 people. I'm going to ask you to conduct an audit right now of your relationships, especially that inner circle, and ask yourself, who's in that inner circle with you? And do they show you those characteristics that we described? Do they belong there? Sometimes I'll ask that question of clients of mine, and I'll find out they don't have anyone in that inner circle or not enough. In which case, I'll ask them to identify 5 names of people who would be good candidates to be in that inner circle. And by that I mean they have those characteristics that I just described. You know, vulnerability, empathy, they can practice confidentiality, you know, they're not going to melt down. If I melt down a little bit, there'll be a mutuality about us. And so that once they have that list, to see what they can do about bringing somebody in just a little more and a little bit more. Brene Brown, her research has indicated that the very guts of close relationships, of those relationships that bring resilience to us, is vulnerability. Guess what we have a lot of these days during this pandemic? We got a lot of vulnerability around, don't we? What does that mean? We've got opportunity. It's as simple as bringing somebody a little closer, is as simple as honestly asking the question, how are you? And listening for the answer. And when that question gets asked of you, to honestly and vulnerably answer that question and just see if there's not an opportunity here. Because this pandemic, we're going to get through it. We're getting it on the other side of it. For those of us who take this opportunity to exercise relationship, and pull some people in closer or deepen the relationships that are in there, we'll be better off in some ways on the other side of this pandemic than we were before the pandemic. And so that's our message for this week. So on behalf of my cameraman Adam, who's standing over there 10 feet away, and his family and my family, we're in solidarity with you. Be well, be safe, and we'll see you next week for another conversation on building and maintaining resilience in difficult times.